So I recently beat Palworld, at least what's currently available on offer in early access, which is to say that I've taken down the 5 tower bosses, and man, this game has some grinding issues. The late game of it is just not fun at all. And it comes down to a number of factors, really. It has a lot to do with the ways that the automation of crafting is just broken, the bullet sponginess of enemies, not knowing how to scale your difficulty properly. It's a lot, and I understand this is an early access game, but these feel like kind of fundamental things. And then there's even the question of whether or not I think things can improve, which is kind of its own can of worms. So, seeing as this is my first one of this style of video, I feel I should probably explain. Obviously, I don't want talking about these games to take up so much of my time that I'm not still making progress on games. So I plan to do these kind of almost like vlog style videos where I can just talk about my thoughts on a game that I've recently beaten, edit the audio, and just ship it out. I don't think there's going to be a lot on these graphically, at least to start. Maybe if I can get the hardware together to start doing like game capture for like all of my playthroughs, then I could start including like B-roll or like specific segments of things that are particularly noteworthy. But I don't know. I do have a capture card, it's just I don't have the storage for it right now. But that's kind of talking future state, I guess. So I guess bringing it back to Palworld, I should probably establish some baseline knowledge about the game. I recognize that like it really blew up, but if there's someone who just kind of saw the whole thing and let it sidestep them, then I probably want to include something to get them up to speed. And I'll probably also include a timestamp or something for anyone that wants to skip that. So okay, what exactly is Palworld? The elevator/marketing pitch for it is Pokemon with guns. In actuality, it's a lot closer to Ark Survival Evolved, but instead of dinosaurs, you have knockoff Pokemon. It's not inherently a bad idea, and that's one of the things I want to talk about, is how this game reflects on Pokemon and the desires of its fan base. Probably get into that towards the end. So the core gameplay loop here, we're not dealing with a rich story. There's no turn-based combat. There's barely any type advantages. There's no evolving your pals. Not even like a Digimon-esque or Shin Megami Tensei-like system of fusion, really. The closest mechanic to this is like, what is it called? Condensing essence? And really, that's almost a mechanic from like a gacha game where you just have to catch a bunch of the same pal and then sacrifice a bunch of them so that one of them goes up a star rating. It's like exactly from a gacha system, except worse, because the amount of pals that you have to catch is like, I want to say the tiers of it go like 4, 8, 16, 32. I don't think there's a 64. And all of it just to like get some stats on one of your pals. It's ultimately an unnecessary system as things currently stand. Best case scenario, it's like a way for you to just like dump excess pals from your box, but you can just sell them to merchants. I don't know why this would be the system that you want to use for that. It's confusing, and a great number of things in this game are, but I'm getting away from the idea of just establishing what it is. So yeah, there's the only element of this game that really is like Pokemon is just the PAL design and the fact that there are PAL spheres that you use to catch these things. That's about as far as it goes. If we're gonna draw a comparison to any Pokemon game, I mean, if anything, it matches up to the way that you would catch Pokemon in Legends Arceus. Not any of the mainline titles, but combat is nothing like Pokemon, which I think can be a good or a bad thing depending on like personal preference. There's basically no story to speak of. There's an intro cutscene where your Nintendo Switch tablet tells you about the towers and the Erd tree that's always in the background, and that's about it. It tells you to go to these towers, and each of these towers is controlled by a different faction. You have essentially the police, you have a crime syndicate that's supposed to be like a Team Rocket parallel. There's these like Brothers of the Pyre who exist on like a volcano, and there's like a genetic research team, but you never learn anything about them. They all interact with you in basically the same way. It's very bare bones in that regard. So you get this guidance to go to these different towers, and then you're just kind of let out into the world. There's a tutorial that helps you get your first base up and running and helps you with catching your first pals. None of it involves like dialogue with NPCs. It's just essentially a quest log, a checklist of activities to complete so that they're no longer on your screen. And then once those are done, you just kind of play the game. And so a lot of the moment-to-moment gameplay involves one of a few different tasks. You can go out and harvest resources, whether that's wood, stone, quartz, coal, sulfur. I guess arguably you could say that catching pals is collecting resources in a way, which thematically these pals, they're not your friends, they're a resource, which is another major distinction from Pokemon. So there's collecting resources, and then there's base management and crafting and attempting to automate crafting. And that all kind of falls into one big bucket with this game. So you finish up the tutorials and you have a small base that's running. You have the means of summoning a couple pals at your base to gather stone and wood and just kind of lessen the burden on you as the player so that you can do what should be more exciting things. Really, the most exciting things, quote unquote, that you can do right now is like catch pals and fight boss pals and fight these towers. That's kind of the extent of it. Everything else is just crafting. It's just resource gathering, crafting, and trying to automate that crafting so that you don't have to do as much of it yourself. But the problem there is that the automation itself breaks all the time for a variety of reasons. So I was communicating with some friends via text and just sent a whole bunch of stuff outlining this. I think I'm just gonna read that whole thing now. Let's start with some of the basics. With any crafting or survival game, you're going to work your way up through tiers of gear and equipment. In Minecraft, you go from wood to stone to iron to diamond, with the only limiter being your own ability to survive, which can be augmented with better gear. In Terraria, you have like 10 different tiers of ores, all gated behind boss progression. And then in Factorio, there's a whole research process that consumes huge amounts of items in order to unlock higher tier goods, which in turn requires that you overcome the logistical challenge of automating the creation of those items before you can proceed. In Palworld, an experience and level up system gates your ability to create new infrastructure upgrades, better weapons, and items that unlock your pal's special abilities. You get like 2 to 4 experience whenever something gets done on your base, if you're there, but the main way you gain experience and level up is beating bosses and catching pals. You also get an experience bonus for the first 10 pals you catch of a given species, and for your first win against any given boss. Despite being branded as Pokemon with guns, there is no evolution, so there's no experience gains for making that happen. On top of that, once you've passed the level gate to unlock new recipes, you also have to spend technology points to then actually be able to craft them at the appropriate station. And you only get so many of these technology points per level up. The only other source I've found for technology points is discovering new fast travel locations, which awards just 1 TP each time. There's also ancient technology points that unlock a few recipes, but those are pretty easy to ignore for the sake of this discussion. After you've actually unlocked a new thing, then we come to the gathering and crafting mechanics. In Minecraft and Terraria, you typically have to gather the materials by hand, but once you do, it's an instant craft. In Factorio, the act of crafting does take some time, but both the gathering of materials and the crafting can be automated. In Palworld, crafting an item or building a new piece of infrastructure at your base has a hefty time requirement. There is some automation available to you, but there's a big asterisk on that. Everything can be gathered or crafted directly by you or by a pal with the trait necessary to perform that task. Mining, logging, harvesting crops, watering crops, crafting at a bench or assembly line, transporting goods, and some others are all available traits a pal species may or may not possess. Your pals can also only perform these tasks within the defined boundary of your base. So if you want to set up automated ingot processing, by the way, it's just called an ingot. It's not like an iron ingot, but in some of the menus, they call it, I think it's copper ore, but then nothing else corroborates that, and it's not like there are other kinds of ore anyway, so you just call it ore. But anyway, to set up automated processing for these things, here's what you need. A base with at least one ore node within its boundaries, a pal with the mining trait, a pal with the transportation trait to bring mined ore to a chest, a furnace, a pal with the kindling trait to provide fire to the furnace. But all pals deployed in your base still have individual hunger and sanity bars and need to take frequent breaks to eat, sleep, or hang out in a hot tub to improve their sanity. So to support all of that, you also need a berry plantation to grow berries for your on-base pals to eat, a pal with the planting trait to replant the berries after each harvest, a pal with the watering trait to water the berries after they're planted so that they'll grow, a pal with the gathering trait to harvest the berries when they're finished growing, which is time-gated, naturally. Your transportation pal can also pull double duty and transport the berries from the plantation to a special food container from which pals can automatically eat any food inside whenever they get hungry, a hot spring to restore your pal's sanity, and 1 bed per pal on base, so a minimum of 6 beds in this scenario to also mitigate sanity loss. Again, this is like the bare minimum, so as you progress through the game, maybe you'll have 3 miners, 2 transporters, 4 dedicated crafters, 2 kindlers, whatever you need, for which you'll also need to scale up food production and beds. In concept, this is fine, but here's all the ways it can go wrong. A necessary pal in this production chain can get stuck on an object, be rendered immobile, and won't perform their task until you essentially put them back in the pal box and pull them back out to reset their position. You can't set the furnace to produce infinite ingots, nor can you set it to an arbitrary number greater than the material you currently possess. So you have to first gather a sufficient amount of ore, queue up the processing of all that ore, and return each time that ore is finished processing to queue up more ore processing. Pals do minimal damage to ore nodes with mining level 1 or 2, and these traits are locked to a pal species, so you can't just have a pal work on your base and slowly level up their skills. If you're a purist who's looking to not use any walkthroughs when you play a game, then you have to go find bigger, stronger pals, survive catching them, and hope they happen to have a mining level 3 trait. You just kind of have to try every pal until you find one. But if you aren't going for like that level of purity, for which totally fine, then yeah, you can just look it up. And obviously I would do this when it got into the late game and I really didn't want to have to explore this gigantic map just to find one pal that would be helpful. But yeah, you end up needing a mining level 3 pal in order to effectively increase your ore gathering output. Bigger pals need bigger beds and eat more food, which requires additional infrastructural investment of the ingots and other materials you're already producing, rather than putting them towards ammo or pal spheres, for example. If a pal has multiple traits, say logging and planting, they will do whichever task when it's available to them. You can't, say, turn off specific traits in order to better focus that pal's efforts. You can pick them up and throw them at something like a furnace to assign them to just that task, but if you leave your base or a random raid encounter begins, a pal will completely forget its fixed assignment and you will have to reassign them. If another pal is currently working at, say, a furnace, you have to first move that pal somewhere else before you can assign the pal you want to that furnace. Sometimes, the whole system of picking up and throwing pals becomes unavailable for no apparent reason, and the only way to know if this bug has occurred in the first place is to run up to the pal and not see the pickup prompt. So then you have to run back to the pal box, put the pal back in, and pull them out to reset them, just like if they get stuck on something, in order to gain the pickup option again. And built on top of all of this jank, we finally have the late game resource issues one would describe as being grindy. Here's the recipes for each tier of pal sphere as an example. The original pal sphere you unlock at level 2. It costs 1 palladium ore, 5 wood, and 5 stone to craft 1 pal sphere. Moving on, we have the megasphere, which you unlock at your personal level of 14, and each megasphere costs 2 palladium ore, 7 wood, and 7 stone. Next is the Gigasphere, which you unlock at level 20. Each one requires 3 palladium ore, 3 ingots, 10 wood, and 10 stone. Then the Hypersphere at level 27, which requires 5 palladium ore, 5 ingot, 12 wood, and 2 cement, which is its own crafting recipe that you have to account for. Then we have the Ultrasphere at level 35, which requires 7 palladium ore, 8 refined ingots, which is a combination of ore and coal, and requires its own furnace to be able to craft, 3 of the aforementioned cement, and 3 carbon fiber, which is a different way of processing coal altogether. And then finally you have the Legendary Sphere, which you unlock at level 44, keeping in mind that the max level is 50, and a single Legendary Sphere costs 10 palladium ore, 10 pal metal ingots, which again require a different furnace than the refined ingots or the regular ingots, and have their own crafting time associated with them that's longer than the previous 2, 5 cement, and 5 carbon fiber, again, to produce 1 sphere. In many regards, this makes sense. Higher tier recipes require more materials, but this is how much you have to invest in single-use consumables at late game. And we haven't even talked about ammo for your guns, where you can spend upwards of 50 bullets in a single boss fight. God forbid you lose that fight and use all those bullets for nothing. None of it gets refunded. The crafting time for each of these recipes also increases, meaning you need pals with higher levels of the crafting and kindling traits to make these in any reasonable amount of time. All the while, your automation is constantly breaking or underperforming for all the reasons above, and essentially cannot function without your presence at your base. And attempting to improve your base comes at huge cost. Want a stronger pal to more efficiently gather ore? Great! Your only option is a level 47 boss that's going to take 50 shotgun shells and 20 hyperspheres to weaken and catch it. In other words, it's going to cost tens of ingots and several minutes of crafting to make like a 5% improvement in your base's function, which will all be for naught when your new pal gets stuck on top of the mining node and won't just mine it to remove the obstruction to their pathing because they're hungry and trying to get to the food box. Coming back to the Pokemon comparison real quick, there's also only like 5 types of pals in this game. I want to say it's like, let's see, there's normal and dark, grass, water, fire, electric, and ice, and then I think there's a ground type, but I don't think there's a rock type, nor like a steel type. I think dark kind of encompasses like psychic as well, so there's no psychic, there's no fairy, I don't think. There isn't like a light type as like a counter to the dark type, I don't think. I think there's a dragon type. And I'll be honest, I do not know the weakness or like super effective chart for this game. Obviously some of it seems intuitive and, you know, follows the same rules as Pokemon, where electric beats water, water beats fire, fire beats grass, but I don't know how dark interacts with any of these things. I assume normal doesn't hit anything for super effective damage, but I just don't know. I didn't bother to test any of these things in all of my time with this game. For the record, I probably spent over 100 hours on this game. I don't understand when people say that they've beaten the whole thing within like 60. I ended up playing this on Microsoft Game Pass, so I don't have the time tracking like I would with Steam, but I spent like 2 or 3 weeks straight just playing this game, because with it being Game Pass, it's a monthly subscription, so I wanted to try to finish up the game before the subscription could tick over again, and then I could just cancel the subscription and not think about that service for a while, because it would introduce far too many games to the backlog if I were to keep it long term. So in all of my time, the game didn't teach me much about the type chart, nor was it necessary to learn it, which I guess kind of brings me to combat in general. In the early game, it's whatever. You're whacking sheep and chickens with a stick and then catching them in a ball. It's fine. When it comes to late game combat and facing off against these bosses, there isn't anything fundamentally different that you would find facing off against Chillet. I think Chillet is not terribly far from the starting area and is like a level 11 or 12 boss. There isn't some radical difference between the way that fighting Chillet works versus, say, Anubis, who's level 47 out of 50, or any of the tower fights, really. They all play exactly the same, which is to say, the enemy just seems to use all of their available moves in sequence. So if they have like 7 moves, they'll use move number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then after 7, they just go back to 1. And so if move number 3 is a ranged move, and then move number 4 is a melee move, then as soon as they're done casting move number 3, they'll just start running towards whoever their target is so that they can put them in range of that melee move. And you can abuse this because, like, if you can get your opponent stuck on the terrain, like if they're actively chasing you and you can put something between the two of you, the pathing is so rudimentary that they might not even try to find a way around that obstacle if it's like truly impassable, like a wall. I actually got what was it? I defeated a Mamorest, which was level 33, and just happened to walk up to my base and got caught in one of the raid encounters, and so I had to deal with it one way or the other. But I ended up getting him stuck against like a ledge, and he couldn't figure out to just walk to the left up the hill and get on top of the ledge. He just kept making a straight line for the pal he was trying to hit with a melee attack, and so he just stayed up against this ledge and did nothing for like 10 minutes straight until something happened to knock him out of it. I want to say I was like level 17 when this happened, maybe 14, and you know, I eventually whittled him down and got very lucky with the catch and had a Memorest super early, but it wasn't even helpful as like a partner at my base or in combat because the level of your pal is like locked to your personal level. So like if in the case where I have this level 33 Memorest, it gets artificially reduced down to my level 14 or 17, whatever it happens to be. And then when I level up to 18, it's now artificially scaled down to 18 and so on. Like it won't even gain experience until I'm a level ahead of it. So what did my late game combat actually look like? I think I only defeated 2 of the towers before I was like level 48 or something like that, where I actually unlocked the assault rifle and had an actual machine gun for the first time in like 100 hours of play. And yeah, my team for the actual tower boss fights was like Petalia, so that I could have the emergency 400 HP heal. From any research I was doing online, I didn't see any better options than that, which is kind of ridiculous. I had put a lot of points into my health. I think I had like 2,000 base before my PAL metal armor. In addition to the Petalia, I also had, what was it? Like that kind of like vampire looking guy. I think he's getting compared to Darkrai a lot online, but his ability when he's out is just passive lifesteal for you. Every time you make an attack, you get a fraction of it back as health. So that was like my primary health recovery method while waiting for my shields to recharge. And then my other 3 PAL slots were just all Anubis. Just Anubis. Because the last 3 tower bosses, I want to say the main types of their PALs were fire, electric, and ice. Across the 3 of them. Some of them might have been part dragon or part dark, but that doesn't really matter. So obviously the Anubi were not well suited to the ice tower, but other than that, the ground typing could just hold its own against fire and electricity. And Anubis has at least 3 signature moves, and it's basically guaranteed to be near max level because you catch it at level 47 and it's just artificially deflated to whatever you are. So it's like, why would I bring literally anything else unless it has like a type disadvantage? In which case, I think I just like caught some reasonably high level guys in like the volcano area. There's the one that's like fiery Grottle or Torterra. I can't remember his name. It's like Arsox or something. I had like a couple of him for the ice fight and something else. And yeah, with the assault rifle, I mean, I was able to do like significant damage to these bosses to the point that I could actually beat them. But oh my god, the amount of resources I had to invest in like bullets was ridiculous. Because similarly to the spheres, the resource requirements for ammo also scale up. Just off the top of my head, I believe you can craft arrows with just like wood and stone, nothing else. Some of the first ammo that you craft for like the musket and the makeshift handgun, I think, it's 1 ingot, 1 gunpowder makes 10 bullets. Pretty quickly, I think with the proper handgun ammo, it shifts to like 1 ingot, 1 gunpowder makes 5 bullets. So you're now having to spend twice as many resources on something that fires way faster for less damage per shot when you have the proper handgun versus the musket. And so it just proceeds from there as you just continue to unlock guns. You get a better slow single shot rifle, you get a shotgun, and then you eventually get the proper machine gun. And then there's also a rocket launcher at max level, but I did not bother getting to it. I got far enough to get the assault rifle and palmetto armor and said, that's it, I'm just beating the game with these. Because like, I don't care if the rocket launcher is just an absurd amount of damage in a single shot. The resource investment I would have to make hundreds of those rockets was just not appealing to me. And like, my bases were set up for efficiency. By the time I hit late game, I realized that my initial base placement, just right on that initial continent where I think like everybody makes their first base, it didn't serve me in any particularly great capacity. I had set up a base in the desert that had access to at least one sulfur node, and I could really easily just go get coal from like outside of that range. It was also like right next to the Anubis boss. And then I looked up a location for quartz that had like 7 of those nodes in it on like a mountaintop, and just set up a base there so that any of the like microchips, whatever they were called, just so that I could produce as many of those as I would need without having to worry about it too much. And so I ended up moving my initial base to a spot with like 7 ore nodes. But you know, then I just ran into all the problems with automation that I laid out before. It didn't matter that I had this base with 5 dig toises with level 3 mining and like the entire support structure that I laid out to make sure that the base stays functional, because the dig toises would just get stuck on top of the ore nodes. Like 3 of them would get up there and just stay there until they were starving, and I just happened to visit the base and mine the ore node that they were all stuck on top of until it was small enough for them to walk off it and get over to the feed box. So late game, I was still gathering most of the materials that I needed myself because it was so much faster and the automation was unreliable. I would go out with a party of my Nightwing and 4 King P.A.K.K.A.s to increase my carry weight. And it was just go out, gather all the ore I can carry, go back, go to a coal patch, gather all the coal I can carry, go back, set up refined ingot crafting for more ammo, gather a bunch of sulfur, go back, bring the sulfur back, probably get another load of coal, bring that back, use the coal and sulfur to make gunpowder, get that started crafting. While the furnace was going and while the gunpowder crafting was going, I'd probably do like 2 or 3 trips of like ore and coal gathering just to have it on hand so that once this set of refined ingots and gunpowder was done, I could just queue up more so that I would just have a stockpile to work with. And so when I was like finally ready to attempt some of these tower bosses, I think I attempted the 4th tower with 1,000 machine gun bullets, which you craft 5 at a time. So it takes like 20 crafts to make 100 of them. And so I guess that means I needed to craft assault rifle ammo like 200 times, each with stiff time requirements. It's very lucky that Anubis also has crafting level 4 in addition to just being like a combative powerhouse. So when I wasn't actively taking on a boss fight or something, I would just deploy those Anubi at the base. And again, with all the automation problems, would eventually get them all assigned to like the assembly line so that I could craft those things efficiently and it wouldn't take 3 years. So like something like 100 hours of gameplay in, and I'm still having to do all of this manual stuff to just replenish my ammo count. Whereas like, you know, within 10, 20 hours of Factorio, I know I could set up essentially like infinite handgun ammo if that's like what I needed. Within like 80 hours of Factorio, you unlock energy weapons, which just don't even require ammo to like recharge. What an idea, right? Having a way of getting out of this like crafting and refining rat race. Boy, would that have been nice in Palworld, but yeah, I think that about covers my experience. Oh, I didn't talk about the custom difficulty settings. So this is where a lot of my issues with the game's balance comes in, because generally my philosophy when it comes to playing through a lot of these games is I just try to play them at what is the intended difficulty setting. Most of the time, this is just normal difficulty. In the case of Palworld, it means like normal difficulty and none of these custom modifiers. But I was just having like such a tough time and every everything was like taking so long that just to save my own sanity, I was doing things like doubling the catch rate of pals with my spheres so that I wasn't wasting so many resources to just catch a single pal in one of these gigaspheres. I like ended up tripling my own experience game because it would just take so long to level up so that I could make one small infrastructure improvement to my base. And again, the only method of leveling up was just catching pals and defeating bosses, both of which drain your consumable resources, meaning that you end up in this weird cycle of gather, craft, go out, gain XP, gather, craft, go out, gain XP. And that's just the whole game. There's nothing else to work towards. There's nothing to obfuscate that grind. You can't fall back on like, let's make some story progress or let's go do a quest for an NPC, because those things just don't exist. And it gets tiring. So you go and like fuck with the settings just to make it all bearable instead of actually like having fun. So I should probably talk about my experience with the final tower of the 5. So I ended up attempting the final tower, I think it was 4 times before I beat it, each with their own, what do I even call it? Like, at no point was this fight fun. At no point did it feel like a challenge to overcome. This wasn't fighting Gwyn in Dark Souls 1, where I had to like reevaluate my play strategy and, you know, make sure I was like well prepared. And, you know, I recognized that I was gonna have to die several times just to like learn his patterns so that I could know like how long of a window I had to attack and when I had to dodge roll. None of that. It's the same combat for the entire game, so I know what I'm getting into. The only question is, what is my damage output versus the 10-minute timer that's placed on this fight? And if my damage output by like the 5-minute mark is that he's not at half health, then I know to just die and mess with the settings until that number feels right. So over the course of these 4 attempts, I ended up putting my player damage to 5 times what it normally was in order to actually deal over 200,000 damage within 10 minutes. Like, that's what it took. I could not do it at 1 times, and I don't think a rocket launcher would have fixed that problem. And I found out I also couldn't scale my pal's damage in this way because the pal damage multiplier setting for difficulty doesn't just affect your team, it's all pals. If I were to like triple pal damage, I'd just get 1 shot by the boss, or maybe 2 shot. And the same would go for my pals. They would just get 1 shot by a boss attack, and then they're fainted, or whatever they actually call that status in Palworld, and you can't use them for the rest of the fight. So after you beat the 5th tower, there's nothing special. There isn't a cutscene, there's not like a credit roll, which I'm not expecting a credit roll because I know that the big world tree is the actual like final location. But I don't know, you would still expect like a cutscene that's just like, hey, congrats, you did it, here's the tree, go face the final boss, but doesn't exist. So I started making my way out to the tree anyway, and like it's clearly got its own spot on the map. It's not like I was like up against the edge of the map or anything before even getting there. It has to exist as part of their world design, but there's a barrier around it. It's effectively an invisible wall, but they did at least put a red gradient on it so that you actually knew it was there, and that your, last 5 minutes of holding W across an ocean was indeed for naught. That's all that's available right now, is just the 5 towers, and you get absolutely nothing for it, except the experience and ancient technology points for killing a boss, and the technology point for getting the fast travel point at the top of the tower. Which, why do those even exist? Is the idea that, like, Breath of the Wild, you would want to come back to these towers for, like, a high vantage point, and then parasail to some objective, but like you get a saddle for a Nightwing at like level 15, and it just invalidates all of the climbing mechanics, the parasail, all of it, because you can just fly. It's still limited by your player stamina, even though the PAL is the one that's flying, but whatever. I understand that you probably need to put some limitations on that, but I don't understand the towers at all functionally outside of like housing a boss fight. And there's no like lead up to them either. In Pokemon gyms, there's usually like a couple trainers and like a puzzle before you get to the gym leader. You just walk into the gym leader fight and that's it, which wouldn't be a problem if, you know, the boss fights were any good. So, okay, the game is early access. It has a lot of problems, especially at the end game. The extremely obvious retort to any of the criticism or problems that I've laid out is, well, they could just fix it. And that kind of leads me into one topic that I wanted to talk about, which is like, I am skeptical that this game will see the improvements that it needs. From all the discourse that's been going on around this game, I've learned that the dev team had like previously released what was essentially a Breath of the Wild clone plus crafting, and Palworld is Breath of the Wild plus crafting plus Pokemon sometimes with guns. And so I don't get an artistic vision from this game or this developer's output. If you look at a company like Supergiant, who are obviously like one of my favorites, and you look at the care and artistic value put into Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, Hades, and Hades 2. And like when Hades 1 hit early access, because of my backlog project, I completely avoided it because I knew it wouldn't have a solid ending when it first hit early access. But I would still see that progress was being made on it, and based on the team's prior output in, you know, Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, I was still confident that they would deliver a good product. And Hades ended up being a contender for Game of the Year when it actually hit 1.0 and came out of early access for me. I don't see that happening with Palworld based on what I've seen from the devs thus far. I still hope that it does receive support. You would think if you have this like runaway hit and you sell like millions of copies, that you as like a game developer would be like, oh shit, this is like, I've done it. I've made a hit video game. Now I can work on refining this vision that I've had for like the next few years. Like my bills are paid and I can just focus on making this the best experience for people that I could ever want it to be. Or the funding from this would mean that the scope for my next game can be that much larger. I can afford to work on it that much longer and not have to worry about bills. But like I was saying, I don't see that vision from this team. From its inception, this game kind of seems to have only been made to like chase trends or just like throw together popular ideas. And so because of that, I don't know if they'll stick with this. It's entirely possible that this could go the route of like Cube World or Towns or any number of Kickstarters where they have an initial idea and like put it out in early access and it makes a lot of money and then just radio silence, or there's some sort of trouble with the development and it ends up just completely stalling out. I think that's a very real possibility for Palworld. Either the team just lives off the millions. I mean, this game sold like over 8 million copies, right? I don't care if that's a team of 20 people. And what, they were charging like $30? So let's even say they only get a cut of like half of that. So it's like 4 million, and then you divide that by 20 people in just these absolute like ballpark numbers. So what, you knock a zero off that and cut it in half again. So that's 200,000 a person, which I don't know. I feel like median income in the US is still somewhere between like 50 and 70K, median like household income. And so like you could live off that for like a couple years, or like if you have a day job that isn't gaming, you can just invest that, and like that's it. You're just set if you just let $200,000 mature over like 30 years. I don't know. This sort of like runaway hit could also serve as like an exit strategy, the counterpoint that I'm raising here. And so like we really don't know what's going to happen with this game from here, and that's always the gamble with early access. But we'll see. I would like to see this game improve. I would like to see the automation refined, which I think would be a huge improvement. I would like to see a story and an ending, probably like signature mechanics for different bosses so that they actually like feel different. Then they can also get into the hard work of like refining the balancing and just finding other like fun things to throw in there. Hades added a fishing minigame, like just because that's like what the community wanted. It's a crafting game. Sure, they could throw a fishing minigame in there. Why not? Just something to help flesh it out, give you something to do during downtime while you're crafting. I don't know. There's so much they could do with it. And just like as it stands, it just feels so bare bones. Man, the things they could do with this. And I guess this kind of like segues into my last topic, which is just the fact that the success of this game, for the controversy that was generated around it, for the dev team's track record, this isn't meant to be some love letter spiritual successor to Pokemon. This is, we're tacking Pokemon on to our previous game, which was really just like chasing trends. It's like a step up from an Asylum movie. And the fact that it was able to be such a runaway commercial success, I think speaks to the complacency of Game Freak and Nintendo as it relates to their most profitable property. It's like, what? Pokemon is like legitimately the like best-selling franchise of all time across like every medium that it touches or something like that. I personally feel like the output over the course of the Switch's lifespan has been really lacking. The games have been buggy, they've been poorly optimized. The graphical style that they were using on the 3DS just hasn't translated well over to 3D, and everything just looks so low res for a HD capable console. All of this is without even talking about, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl just being like the laziest of any of the generational remakes that we've ever seen, where it's literally just the same game as Diamond or Pearl with a new art style and whatever moves and abilities have been added to these Pokemon since Gen 4 originally came out. But like none of the content from Platinum, no extras like the Sevi Islands from Fire Red Leaf Green, nothing to really justify it as a remaster. What, were they still charging like $40 or was it like a full price $60? I don't even remember. But yeah, there's just this huge gap in the market where Pokemon is just kind of content doing the same things. Legends Arceus is like a relatively fresh direction for them to go, but I feel like they could still push the combat even further from its turn-based roots. Then they might be onto something that feels fresh and new and exciting, but they don't have to be fresh and new and exciting to just make buckets of money, so they don't. So there's just this huge gap that's left where like everyone sees what Pokemon could be but isn't. And so you have games like Palworld, which despite their own flaws show what Pokemon could be. Pokemon could go all in on crafting. They've already gone open world. There could be more active fights like we saw in Legends Arceus. You can actually get the player character involved beyond throwing Pokeballs, or what did you even do against the bosses? Like you threw like rocks, or like it was like some sort of like smoke bomb powder to like calm them down, something like that. There's more that could be done there, and people are looking for this, yearning for it. Any average or mediocre player that comes into that space has the opportunity to capitalize because Game Freak and Nintendo aren't capitalizing on it. It's the same thing of why like no Smash Bros. Arena fighter gains the same following that Smash Bros. Actually has, because Smash Bros. Is a good game. Outside of like really niche like fighting game reasons of like with Smash on like Wii U and 3DS, it was inherently like a really defensive game. And so if you just weren't a fan of that, or you wanted like ledge hogging like Melee had, then you could turn to Rivals of Aether, which has like no ledge grabbing, a lot of really interesting like recovery denial mechanics, I think, from like the videos I've watched, because I haven't bothered playing it. I just played Smash Bros. And so like that's what Pokemon isn't doing. They aren't shutting the door and just releasing the kind of products that would cause the rest of these games to flounder in comparison. I really think there's a market that if someone did a better version of Palworld, that it could make even more money. And that's wild to say, that Pokemon games can pull in like millions of units sold, Palworld can pull in millions of units sold, and neither of these are game of the year. There is such an unaddressed market that it's insane. And I don't know, I would love to see quality release from literally anybody that really properly capitalizes on these things. And Palworld could be that in several more years, but I don't know, man. I'm not willing to invest based on that chance, but we'll see. I think that's about all I have to say on it. It's big, it's complicated. I would have loved to make like a more proper, well-researched video on this, but you know, I'm still working on what I consider to be like the foundational videos of this channel, and there are multiple. But you know, it's taking a long time to create these art assets, which I don't resent. It's something I've kind of understood. I think after I have the first few of these big foundational videos under my belt, that I'll be able to deliver the quality that I'm hoping to deliver in a more meaningful amount of time. Or I should say a shorter amount of time. But yeah, I'm probably going to be making more things like this soon. Ideally, I would like to do this for each game that I beat, and I don't think that they're going to be this long usually. I think my second game beaten for this year was Jack 2, and man, I'm gonna have a lot of negative things to say, but it should be way less than this. So, yeah, I think I'll just leave it there for now. I guess I need like some sort of sign off, right? I don't know. I'll catch you all next time, I guess.